It's good to be here today. My name is Michaela Madrid, and I am the Operations Manager for the Sovereign Bodies Institute. Today, we're really excited for a great conversation about Savannas Act. Today, we're joined by Sarah Deer and Mary Kathryn Nagle, and we're just so excited to dive in a little more about what Savannas Act does, kind of the advocacy that it took to get us there, and now that it's passed, what's next. So with that, I'd welcome Sarah and Mary Kathryn to turn on their videos and give a little bit of an introduction. Anything you'd like to share with our viewers, your name, tribal affiliation, and where you're calling from.
Sarah, you go first. Oh, you're on mute. Sarah, you're on mute.
Yes, story of my life. I get mad when other people are on mute, and then I do the same
The phrase
thing.
of 2020, unmute
That's
yourself.
right. Unmute yourself. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Deer. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. I'm a professor at the University of Kansas. So I'm coming to you today live from Lawrence, Kansas, a wonderful college town. I teach in the area of gender studies as well as public administration and part-time at the law school as well. I am a lawyer, and I worked for the federal government, for nonprofits, and now for academia. My area of my scholarship is the intersection of federal Indian law and violence against women. And I am also the Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. Thanks for having me, and thanks to SBI for hosting this important event.
Great. And hi, everyone. I'm Mary Kathryn Nagle. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I apologize for some of the background noise. My fiance, I guess, determined that right now is the time to blow all the leaves off the deck. So I will put myself on mute when I'm not talking, and hopefully it won't take him too long to do that. Didn't realize that would be happening right now. So I am an attorney. I'm a partner at Pipestem Law. We're a smaller law firm that handles a lot of work on behalf of tribal nations and Native women survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. We also handle a lot of MMIWG cases for families. And we have an office in Oklahoma and an office in Washington, D.C. And beyond representing families and individual survivors, we also represent the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center and have in that work. And I'll say, even though I don't technically as a lawyer represent the Sovereign Bodies Institute, we've partnered on many projects, many efforts. The work that Sovereign Bodies does is so important, both out in the world and behind the scenes. There's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes, as we'll be talking about Savannas Act today, but also I know Grace Bulltail is listening in to this webinar, and I know she's the aunt of Sarah Stops Pretty Places, one of the families I represent. And when we're working with the family to create the 1-year anniversary events to raise awareness about the fact that the FBI, the Bighorn County, none of the law enforcement that should be investigating her murder have even tried to investigate her murder, and it's a year later and they still haven't done their jobs. And so we were working with the family, and NIWRC and SBI really stepped up and hosted events, got the word out via social media, helped send letters to Congress and to the governor and the attorney general and the FBI. And so it's just really nice to be here with SBI today to talk about this and really appreciate all the work that SBI does to support these issues and these movements. And the last thing I'll say before turning it over is that one thing I've been very thankful to be able to do is to work with Sarah together on a number of briefs that we've submitted in the Supreme Court that dating back to 2015 in the Dollar General case that have focused on, always representing the side of safety for Native women when it comes to issues around jurisdiction and tribal sovereignty. And so always honored to be with Sarah in any capacity. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of your kind words about the work that we do. We just as much appreciate both of your partnerships. And I always love when we get to do projects together. So going into our questions here, as you know, we're here to talk about the Savannas Act. So really my first question is, Savannas Act requires the Department of Justice to review, revise, and develop law enforcement and justice protocols to address missing or murdered Native Americans. So that's kind of a lot of policy speak. Could you two maybe break that down to explain what that means in real terms?
Sure. So I just shared my screen. Is that coming through okay for folks?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay. So one of the things that's actually unusual about Savannas Act is it's not a long piece of legislation with a bunch of governmental lingo. It's 7 pages long, and that includes this sort of blank cover page. And so anytime one of these laws passes, I think it's great for advocates to read it very carefully with a highlighter, find out where their face would come in, where their work would come in. And so if I can just kind of walk you through what this looks like, and this is available, online. It tells you here what the citations are, right, and when it passed. And then there's purposes, which are important, but not really the law. There's definitions, which are very important, but not necessarily really the law. And then the question you're asking is really about Section 5, which is titled Guidelines for Responding to Cases of Missing or Murdered Indians. And it's within this section of the Savannas Act that requires the Department of Justice to work on these protocols. So I don't know, Mary Kathryn, if you want to pick it up from there.
Yeah, so, I think just to be clear, this act is a wonderful victory for all of us who advocate for safety for Native women and to end MMIWG. It's named after Savanna Gray Wind, who was horrifically murdered in 2017 in North Dakota, and originally introduced by Heidi Heitkamp, back when Heidi Heitkamp still held one of the 2 senatorial seats from the state of North Dakota. And it's been kind of bouncing around for a while. And Heidi lost her reelection. Senator Heitkamp lost her reelection, and Senator Murkowski sort of picked up the torch. And then, we happened to get some amazing Native women elected in Congress, and Congressman Deb Haaland jumped on to really get it over the finish line. So there's been a lot of work. It's actually really been a bipartisan effort. But I know that like SBI, NIWRC, these groups have been on the Hill advocating to get this bill passed for quite a while. And I will say, all in all, Savannas Act is a huge victory, and it is the result of a lot of hard work of Savanna's family. I know her family advocated for this, individual amazing women like Ruth Ann Buffalo, other advocates like Anita herself, Sarah, SBI, NIWRC. It's not the panacea to the problem. And I just think we have to be honest with ourselves. Like Savanna's, it's not, and so it's been a little irritating to me to hear some folks, President Trump perhaps, act like, oh, I signed Savannas Act, and so therefore I am the president that's dealt with MMIW. And it's like, you should be praised for signing that. That was a good thing you did, but you need to do much more. And you haven't done that during your 4 years. So let's just talk about that, right? And so I think for a lot of us advocates, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but we're looking for restoration of tribal sovereignty, resources to tribal law enforcement and to tribal victim service programs to service victims and survivors. A lot of these, access to databases, which this act does address, but there are some major things that we've been advocating for that's not in this act. So just to be clear, now what is in this act? As Sarah was pointing out, these guidelines are very important. And so what makes them so important? Well, right now, I think if you talk to a lot of folks who've done work on MMIW, whether it's at SBI or, with, family, oftentimes what happens is the United States Attorney's Office in the particular jurisdiction where the Native woman is missing or goes murdered just doesn't do anything. And that's because they're not required to. And what's important about this act is that this act won't require an individual U.S. attorney to bring a prosecution against someone who murders a Native woman. Like, there's nothing in this act that removes prosecutorial discretion or forces attorney generals to bring prosecutions. But I think a lot of the people who fought for Savannas Act believe, and I think there's reason to believe this, that just the act of making these attorney generals sit down and spend time, because if we read down, they have to do it in consultation with tribal governments, right? With victim services. Like, yeah, here we are. Sarah's highlighting the Department of Justice, the FBI, Department of Interior, BIA, tribal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, medical examiners, coroners, tribal, state, and local organizations that provide victim services. Okay, that could include SBI, right? National, region, or urban Indian organizations. Well, that would definitely include like SBI, NIWRC. And I think that, I know a lot of us said too, like, I know SBI said this at one point, like, we need to include victims or victims' families in here too. And that didn't happen explicitly the way I think it happened in Not Invisible Act. The Not Invisible Act actually includes victims and victims' families in the commission that's created. But I think what's important to remember is that, a lot of U.S. attorneys have never given this a minute of time or a minute of thought. And now they're going to have to sit down, and we don't know what those guidelines are going to be, but whatever comes out of this is going to be a lot better than nothing. And every single U.S. attorney is going to be required to do this. And I think what our job is to be going forward is to really engage in this consultation process and to reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office and say, I can't wait to consult. Let me know when it's happening. I'm here, ready to consult. And so I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah, to add to that.
Sure. So what needs to happen then is it's going to move kind of fast. Once the consultation takes place, within 60 days, the Attorney General shall direct the United States attorneys to develop regionally appropriate guidelines. And this is really important because one of the challenges we have with any federal law, including really important, helpful laws like Violence Against Women Act, is it's sort of a one size fits all, right? That there's just going to be one directive. And very rarely is there one solution that's going to work for every tribal community. Each tribal community is unique. Each federal district is unique. And so what's really important here is the language that folks advocated for, that they be regionally appropriate. So the efforts in Alaska are going to look very different from the guidelines that we would want to see in Oklahoma. And so this is a new trend in federal legislation. And I encourage a lot of people to really work on this, because what we found fails is when there's a one size fits all model. So this was a really important component of the Savannas Act, which allows for unique responses to unique circumstances.
The other thing I'll add, I think that's really important to note here, Sarah just brought up the example of Alaska. The very first version of Savannas Act that we saw, and I think this is like no fault to Senator Heitkamp. I don't think she did this intentionally, but this is what happens with Indian law because it's so ridiculously complicated, and there are all these other statutes, Supreme Court decisions. If legislation isn't carefully thought out, accidents happen. In the very first draft that was discussed and considered and voted on in the Senate, limited the U.S. attorneys who had to create these guidelines to only those who had Indian country jurisdiction within their jurisdiction. That would have, because of the Supreme Court's unfortunate 1998 decision in Venati, excluded the U.S. attorney in Alaska from having to create these guidelines. And so I know SBI, NIWRC, all those organizations, I was there in some of those conversations, said, whoa, wait a second. Also, what about our urban populations, right? Okay, the U.S. attorney in Manhattan may not have Indian country jurisdiction, right? Or Los Angeles or Chicago or Baltimore, but that doesn't mean that U.S. attorney in that jurisdiction shouldn't also create these guidelines. And I think that was one of the great changes that we sort of together as advocates were able to create. So every U.S. attorney, even U.S. attorneys without federally recognized tribes within their borders, have to create these guidelines. And I think that's important to remember too, because again, this is a crisis that affects us on reservation land and also in urban areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really like that part that you added about how important it is to not just include these U.S. attorneys with tribes in their jurisdiction, because by making it all U.S. attorneys, it also reinforces the idea that there are Indigenous people everywhere. It's not just that there are only Indigenous people in, the states that we typically think of when we think of Indian country. There are Indigenous people everywhere. And that's an issue we come across a lot at SBI in California. There's a lot of people who don't understand the unique issues that California Native Americans face, and a lot of it is due to this invisibility. So I totally agree that this inclusion of the regionally specific solutions is really important, and that's something at SBI we really advocate for and try to do in our own research, is to bite off the regional pieces, and with the hope that other folks in other regions will do similar research so that they can find solutions for their own communities as well. So we talked a little bit about what is in the Act. So now I'd like to move into kind of our next portion. So as you kind of alluded to earlier, Mary Kathryn, Savanna's Act was first introduced in the Senate on January 25th, 2019, and it was passed just 2 months short of 2 years later. So why did that take so long to pass, and what did the advocacy look like to make it pass? Are there lessons to be learned from this process?
It was pretty fast, actually, comparatively. But
Yeah, I think this was a long, complicated road for some of us because, like I said, that original Heitkamp, what happened with the Heitkamp bills, it passed the Senate, right? And then it got to the House, and there was a member of the House who sat on it and refused to put it to a vote on the House. And so all of a sudden there was this groundswell of folks really saying, oh my gosh, there has to be a vote in the House. But at the same time, some of us Native advocates are like, whoa, hold up. We don't want to just rush to vote in that. We need to edit this because, it was limited to U.S. attorneys with Indian country jurisdiction. And we were like, Alaska is going to be left out. Our urban Native women and Indigenous women are going to be left out. There were a couple other issues in there that I don't think anyone was trying to create intentional harm. It's just we needed to edit the act, right? And so we sort of got that message out. And but at that point, when that was happening, Heitkamp had not won re-election, and so that's when we started working with Senator Murkowski and Senator a couple other senators as well on the Senate side to do a revision to the bill. And actually, a lot of folks came to the table. I know. I worked, the Democratic staff and the Senate committee were very much involved. A lot of folks helped draft this bill. And so I think part of it was for a while that we were advocating for different legislative fixes within the bill. And then, we just sort of hit COVID. I do think there was some momentum to get it passed like a year ago. And we were kind of gaining on that momentum. And then, and I remember having conversations, and then COVID hit, and it was like, well, that's, so personally, it was kind of frustrating that it took this long, but like Sarah said, I mean, with Congress, man, sometimes it can just take a really long time. So.
yeah, and I think it's important to remember so many of us work with the Violence Against Women Act, which was passed in 1994 by, the Biden-Hatch Act, which always cracks me up because Joe Biden and Orrin Hatch, collaborated together, and that's not a pair that you would normally see. But Joe Biden, when he was senator, started having hearings about the Violence Against Women Act in 1990. And it was not until 1994 that the Violence Against Women Act actually passed. So that's one of the really hard lessons that I've learned, because I'm kind of as an activist, it's like action, and when you're working with Congress, especially when you're working with bipartisan challenges, with trying to get Republicans to support Democratic provisions, it takes months and months and months, and we have to be in it for the long haul. And now that we have Savanna's Act, what we'll need to do is build on it, because it's not sufficient to solve the problems that we're looking to solve. But now we have our foot in the door, if you will, and we can go to Congress and say, thank you for Savanna's Act. Here's the next step, right? And so be keeping in mind that it's very difficult, especially if you're working with a family in crisis, you're working with a family, someone who's been murdered and there's been no resolution to that. It's like we needed this yesterday. But unfortunately, when we work with the federal lawmakers, it just sometimes takes more time than you would ever think was required.
Yeah, and one thing I think we should talk about here, is in drafting this act, we had a lot of conversations, right? Because we were working with victims' family members and all of our grassroots organizations and folks. And I think, I mean, if if Grace Bulltail was presenting right now, I think she would say, oh my gosh, you have no idea how challenging it is to try to work with the local law enforcement who just won't do their job, right? So one of our biggest challenges for our sisters and our daughters who go missing or are murdered off reservation lands is that the state or local or county or municipal or city law enforcement don't care, and they do not want to investigate their murders, or they don't want to try to help find them while they're missing. How do we get them to do that? And I think a lot of people wanted Savanna's Act to do that. But constitutionally speaking, Congress can't force local law enforcement to do certain things. They just don't have the constitutional authority to require state and local law enforcement to do things like that. And that's just sort of an unfortunate reality of federalism in our US Constitution. So the way Savanna's Act is structured is there's sort of like an incentive program, which Congress can do. So Congress can basically say, we think local law enforcement should do X, Y, Z. If they do this, then they can get this kind of grant funding for their law enforcement. And if they don't do it, then they don't get this grant funding, right? And that's kind of how the Supreme Court has upheld congressional legislation aimed at state law enforcement. And so I just want to be clear that that's another issue around Savanna's Act, is that, so much of the problems of MMIW, I mean, let's be clear, the FBI, is also refusing to investigate, and Congress could and needs to fix that. The FBI shouldn't be able to say, no, we're not going to investigate when a citizen of a tribal nation is murdered on a tribal reservation or half a mile off a tribal reservation. The FBI should not be able to decline an investigation in those cases. And that's a whole other separate issue. But to get to these local state law enforcement agencies, it's also so critical. And I know SBI does this work. I know UIHI does this work, to advocate before our state legislatures, because our state legislatures can do this, right? So these guidelines, if we're all active and we're all, looking to participate in the consultations that will lead to these guidelines, those can also become frameworks to advocate for legislation in our states to not allow the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office to do what it's doing right now in Sarah's case, right? Or all these other examples. So, just wanted for us to think about that too.
Yeah, and there's so many bills happening at the state and local level as well. And the states are really, the individual state governments do have authority to direct local and municipal and county law enforcement officials to do X, Y, and Z. So it's important. A lot of people are we duplicating it? Or we have a congressional act and we have these state acts? Both are needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate you two bringing that up, because one thing we come across here in California, being a public law 280 state, is most of our cases are under county jurisdiction. And so it's really important to have those relationships at the state and county level. And I think a lot of times tribal advocates don't want to go to the state because they have a feeling that this kind of takes away from this nation to nation relationship, that, as tribes, we should only deal with the federal government. But when it comes to a practical point of view, it really is important to do this advocacy at all levels. So absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I have another question regarding sovereignty. So obviously at the Sovereign Bodies Institute, sovereignty is something that's very important to us. And so in regards to Savanna's Act, how does or doesn't this act uphold tribal sovereignty?
So I'm going to pull this back up here again. This is another section of Savanna's Act. And so one of the things that tribal law enforcement officers have struggled with is just in general, if they pull somebody over, if you're a state officer or state patrol, state highway patrol, or local law enforcement, you pull somebody over, you run their license plate or their driver's license information, and you get their arrest history, any bench warrants, anything that you would need to know as a law enforcement officer to keep yourself safe and keep the community safe. But tribal law enforcement officers are not given consistent access to that database. And that becomes obviously really important when you have somebody missing and you want to be able to find who they're associated with and whether people who are they associated with have criminal records. And so this section of Savannas Act is improving tribal access to these databases so that tribal law enforcement can use the same system that other law enforcement systems use to be able to identify what the situation is, who they're dealing with, and whether or not they have a criminal record.
One other thing that I think in terms of sovereignty. So, you know, one of the things that we all said when we were having these conversations with the good folks on the Hill who were drafting this was, you know, we very much want U.S. attorneys to be creating these guidelines, but we didn't like that the initial version was sort of like, okay, and all tribal nations have to adopt the U.S. attorney's guidelines. And we're like, well, wait a second. Like, you know, what if a tribal nation has its own guidelines and those guidelines might be better, right? And so what I think the act allows for, and let me see if I, it's on here, it's like section F or something. Let me, I have it on my little PDF here, and let me see if I can tell you exactly where I've, so it's F5F. Section 5F. And yeah, and if you go down to F, and so this is the result of our advocacy, right? Of like, hey, we got to respect tribal sovereignty here. Like, yes, make the U.S. attorneys do this, but we also got to recognize that tribal governments are doing this work and have the sovereign authority to do it, right? And that they should be able to submit their own guidelines too. And I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I also think too, I mean, we have to all be clear that, you know, our tribal governments aren't perfect. You know, our nations have survived generations of trauma. We've got, we have our own dysfunction that we're all working through. I think many of our tribal governments are excellent, and the fact that people, you know, have this prejudicial belief that tribal governments aren't legitimate is racist and problematic. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that our governments are perfect or that we don't need to advocate for them to create these guidelines themselves if they haven't already, right? I think a lot of folks know that sometimes our tribal governments don't do their job when a Native woman is missing or murdered on tribal lands. And so, you know, just like we're fighting in the state legislature and in Congress, you know, we also have to advocate before our own tribal governments to truly be sovereign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And actually leads really perfect into the next question, which is just that. How can tribal communities hold their leaders accountable to exercising this sovereignty? You know, it's one thing to have the ability to exercise it, but then it's a completely other thing to actually do that. So how can tribal communities, especially what comes to mind is that a lot of folks say that, well, we engaged with the tribes, but who's to say that the tribes are engaging with families and survivors? And so how can we, as tribal citizens, hold our own tribal governments accountable?
In terms of the tribal governments, I think it really does depend on the tribe. There's not one right or wrong answer. I mean, one of the things we run into, and again, as Mary Kathryn said, this is not unique to tribal governments. We have predators that serve in the state legislatures. We have predators that serve in the federal government. We have predators on the Supreme Court, right? So it's the double standard when people look at, you know, tribes and go, oh my gosh, there's a corrupt council member, or there's a council member that, you know, had beat his wife, right? That doesn't make tribes less sovereign, right? Because we see this happen at the state and federal level as well. The only people that can get tribal law changed are tribal citizens, right? And in some ways, advocates in Indian country or advocates that work with Native women are constantly having to lobby 3 different kinds of government. They have to work with their tribal government, their state government, and then things like Savannas Act with the federal government, right? And that makes the job of a Native advocate so much more time consuming. Whereas, you know, folks that work for the state, you know, they only have to deal with the state and federal. And so that leaves, then you have to choose between, do I lobby my tribal government today, or do I go to a 3 a.m. rape call today, you know? And so we have more at stake. We have more need for more people, so that we're not only just doing the direct services, which is the core of any entity, right, that does this work, but we're also able to quote unquote lobby. And that becomes incredibly time consuming. And I think that's a reason why more and more tribal nations are creating positions to be sort of ambassadors to Washington, D.C., or to a state government, to say, we are the liaison between the tribe and these other governments, allowing advocates to focus their energy on direct services, and then having that support when it comes to, we need to get our tribe to pass a decent rape law. Our rape law is outdated. It's just very time consuming.
So I just really appreciate Sarah's point of, like, you know, I know we have corrupt people in places in our tribal government. We, you know, we're not perfect, right? We're humans. But you know, this is the United States of America, and the currently elected president has openly bragged about sexually assaulting women and getting away with it, right? So, you know, it's like, our governments are not any less sovereign or less legitimate simply because there's some corrupt individuals around that need a lot of healing, you know? But how do we advocate, and how do we advocate for change? And I think some of our tribal governments are doing an excellent job, and some are not. And quite frankly, some right now, I think, would rather be corporations that make money than sovereigns. And we as tribal citizens don't have to elect people who care more about just pure economic development for economic development's sake, and not for sovereignty's sake, for preserving our language, our culture. All of that's related to safety for Native women. And you don't have a nation without women. And I think we know that, right? Women give birth to the next generations. Culturally, you know, we're matrilineal societies, most of us. So, you know, the power of our vote is really important, getting involved in our tribal government and making sure that we're not electing tribal leaders who don't put sovereignty first. And economic development is important. We have to do it. We can't overlook it, but it shouldn't be prioritized to the exclusion of being a sovereign.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction, because it is important to have that balance. You know, we can't make the changes and provide the services that our tribal citizens need without the economic development. But once it becomes at the risk of what, or at the sake of what, is when it really becomes a problem. So now moving into, so now that the legislation has passed, what would perfect compliance look like? You know, a lot of times we are so excited that these bills are passed, and then in the implementation of it, it can kind of fall apart. So in a perfect world, what does compliance with Savannas Act look like?
Okay, let me pull this back up again. Sorry, take me just a second. Okay, so one of the big challenges with any legislation that's sort of aspirational, you know, an idea, right, that how things would change, it's very difficult to put in teeth into those laws. So one of the I know that most advocates who work in Indian country are aware of the full faith and credit problem, right? And back in the original Violence Against Women Act in 1994, it said that tribes and local and state officials had to enforce one another's protection orders, right? That's still not happening, even though it's been federal law since 1994, because there's not really a way to hold folks accountable for that. There's no way to sort of smack their hand and say, do it better. It's just an aspiration. I mean, it is working in a lot of places, but it's still, there's areas where those protection orders are still not given full faith and credit. Within Savannas Act, what I've pulled up here is the teeth, I suppose, that we could look at here. And that is that the Department of Justice is going to have to continue to issue annual reports that they already are obligated to issue. That includes now a new section in these annual reports. And the annual reports were created in the Tribal Law and Order Act in 2010. Every single year, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the main office in DC, is required to release a report about Indian country crime, which includes the cases they looked at, the declination rates, and a lot of other issues. So this is a new piece now that's going to be in that annual report, and it's going to include statistics on missing Indians with information about who and information about how many cases are being resolved. And so that is one way that we have to keep our eye on it. When those reports come out, as advocates, we need to be reading those reports, and there's always some fudging, right, from try to kind of like make things sound a little rosier than they might be, and we need to hold them accountable for that. The problem we're having right now is, to my understanding, Mary Kathryn, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe the Trump administration is following the TLOA requirement of annual reports. So that's another thing, is that they're required to, under the 2010 law, every year we're supposed to get a report. And I don't think we've had one in 3 to 4 years.
Yes, and I can say, I know this is a nonpartisan call, but if you read the Biden policy platform, that's one of the promises from the Biden campaign, is that they will require DOJ and that reporting to start up again. And I think that, you know, there's also in the act specific language that says that Attorney General is required to publish a list of the law enforcement agencies that implement the guidelines. And so when you think about that, that's the U.S. Attorney's offices, but it's also local law enforcement. So for instance, we could look and see, is the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office going to be on that list? And if they're not, then that means they didn't implement the guidelines that the U.S. Attorney in Montana created for MMIW. And then our job as advocates is going to be to publicly shame them for not implementing those guidelines. And I also think that once those guidelines get implemented, then when they break them, then we shame them for breaking them, right? So we'll say, okay, the guidelines say, you know, you immediately contact the family within 12 hours of locating the body, right? Or whatever those guidelines are that are created. We then make sure we hold everyone accountable to them. And, you know, it's true that at the end of the day, all that's required is that these guidelines are created, and whoever implements them gets their name on the DOJ's website, and woohoo, you know, I mean, and they might get some grant funding, but like, if they don't do it, you know, like nothing happens except we shame them. But like, that's kind of how a lot of things in the world do work, quite frankly. And that's how we've been able to achieve a lot of success so far, is that, you know, there has been a public outcry and people are starting to listen about this crisis, and people don't want to be bad on the issue of MMIW. Some folks think they don't care right now, but I think they're starting to feel more and more political pressure. And I think one thing I really want us all to think about in how we will implement and work with Savannas Act going forward as advocates is to not think about it as limited to just tribal, federal, or state law enforcement, but all the other entities out there, like county coroners, medical examiners. Does the medical examiner treat our relatives' bodies with respect? Do they actually legitimately look for the causes that could be murder, or are they just like, oh, it's a Native girl, she probably drank too much, which a lot of people do, right? Like, and so are there guidelines around that, right? And you know, you may have heard about the story of what happened with Kesera Stops Pretty Places, but Terry Bullis, the coroner and the owner of the funeral home that took her body against the family's wishes, just ordered to have her cremated against the family's wishes. When, you know, we still have an ongoing investigation, we should have an ongoing criminal investigation. Of course, the county's not doing their job and the FBI's completely abdicated their duties here. But, you know, the protocols we fight for with these U.S. attorneys should include protocols for how funeral homes, county coroners, medical examiners, anyone who, victim services, anyone who touches an MMIW case in any shape or form. And if the U.S. attorney says, well, I don't have jurisdiction to enforce it, who cares? Savannas Act is about guidelines. Nothing in the act gives you authority or mandates that you enforce anything. You're just creating best practices, and best practices need to include everyone in the community. And I just think we need to push back on any U.S. attorneys who might say, well, I can't include what the county coroner should do in my guidelines. It's like, no, you absolutely can, and you should. So I just think we should all look for that going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece is on the coroner part. That's something here in California where the sheriffs are also the coroners. And think about how big of a conflict of interest that is when the person who, is the sheriff, which is also an elected position, is the one who's determining how people passed away. It doesn't make sense how that could even exist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm. So we've talked a lot about what is in this legislation. And one thing that we've alluded to a lot is what is not in this legislation. And we talked a lot about how this is just the first step. So in your minds, what are those next steps? What are inclusions that are left out of this act that would have really made the act a lot better?
Well, we always want more money, don't we? But throwing money at a problem, as we've seen, doesn't necessarily resolve it. And to that end, I think, there's limits to what Congress can do, right? There are things that they just cannot do under the Constitution. But I would like to see the funding streams, anything that's related to this issue, those funding streams go directly to tribal governments and their affiliated nonprofit agencies. And like I said, most of the time, the advocates in any particular tribal community are stretched so thin that they're barely able to take care of themselves or, take care of their children because you're working 20 hours a day. And so what I would like to see, this is on a personal level, is I would like to see more VAWA money, more OVC money, more allocations so that tribal programs that do direct services and nonprofits that do direct services get more funding for more advocates, but also to create positions for people to work on these kinds of laws and these kinds of bills. Because it's unfair to ask if the tribe has 2 advocates or 3 advocates, that they're supposed to not only provide direct services to everyone on the reservation, but they're supposed to also find time to write up their tribal council president's testimony at the OVC consultation, so we're stretching folks way too thin. So for me personally, that's one of the first things I would think we need. We need more bodies on the ground. We need more Native women and Two-Spirit people, given a decent wage to live on and to do this work.
Yeah, and on that note, I think when we think about funding, and Congress forgets this, and they'll be like, "Oh, tribes want more money," and that was certainly, we had that conversation. We asked for, I can't tell you how many people were like, "Okay, but Savannas Act doesn't fund tribal law enforcement," and we were basically told, if you attach funding to this, it's not going through Congress. And I get it, everyone wants money from Congress, and it's hard to get more money. But the federal government has a federal trust, duty, and responsibility to fund tribal governmental institutions and victim services programs. Why? Not because Native people get privilege or special benefits because they're Native. It's because of the treaties that our nation signed with the United States. The United States wouldn't exist today if they hadn't signed the 300, 400, whatever, however many treaties it was, with all of our tribal nations, which gave the United States legitimacy on the world stage and sovereignty when they didn't have any, in the actual land that we all now live and enjoy and work on and live and die on. And so, so that's one thing. And then you have to understand too, all the laws through Congress and the courts that have really limited the ability of tribal governments to tax in the same way that states, counties, local municipalities are allowed to tax anyone who comes onto their land or lives there, or, tribes. Muskogee Creek Nation just won McGirt. Do they get to charge income tax to anyone, non-Native living within the borders of their reservation? No, right? And so that is a legal framework created by the federal government, and fine, so be it that you have chosen to limit the ability of this group of sovereigns to derive revenue from taxation. Then you better fund it, right? Because you betcha you're letting those states derive taxation dollars to fund their courts, their law enforcement, their victim service programs. And yes, the DOJ does provide funding to victim services, both at states and tribes. But the point is like, okay, you government, federal government limited the ability of tribes to tax. So you better fund tribal government institutions. And it is a trust, duty, and responsibility. And so I think that's one thing going forward we have to fight for, is that, and then there's this ridiculous policy that, that the BIA has had, that they won't fund tribal law enforcement for tribes in PL 280 states, because they're like, or for, they're like, well, we don't need to fund law enforcement here, for tribes in PL 280 states, because the state is exercising that jurisdiction. It's like, no, PL 280 is its own unconstitutional, problematic law. Let's move aside. You still have a federal trust, duty, and responsibility to provide for public safety and to fund those tribal governmental institutions. And I think that's something we have to continue advocating for in the halls of Congress.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, sorry, Sarah, were you about to say?
I was just going to say, but I think, be realistic. I mean, when I was studying VAWA in law school, I saw so many places that could improve and overturn Oliphant and all of these ideas. And those are all important, and we should not abandon any aspirational goals. But we also have to be realistic that there's never going to be a Congress that just decolonizes federal Indian law, in one sweep, right? We're doing these things that are piecemeal. And it's very hard. I'm not a very patient person, especially when it comes to victims and their families. But when we're dealing with Congress, it's slow going. It sometimes takes far longer than it should. And that's why I think a lot of energy we can direct into our tribal governments, who are able to act more quickly, who know what the community needs. And it's hard, to get these landmark bills passed. It takes years, and even the Supreme Court takes years. Dollar General was in the courts for like 8-9 years. I can't even remember how long it was. So there's the long-term, like long-range aspirational goals, and then there's what we can do and change day to day.
Yeah, I think that's a really great distinction. It took how many years to screw it up this badly, so it's probably going to take just as long to undo a lot of that mess.
One of the concerns I have too is that a lot of people are going to look at benchmarks like, okay, we've had the Violence Against Women Act since 1994. Has rape in Indian country gone down? And that would be the metric of success. And that's not how we should be measuring success, because once you create advocacy programs, more people are kind of come forward and report. And so you're going to actually see like rape cases increase. And I worry that if we're not thoughtful about that, people are going to say, well, clearly the law is not working then. And we may find that the numbers of missing and murdered that are reported goes up after Savannas Act. That doesn't mean Savannas Act is a failure. It means it's working, right? Because more cases are coming to our attention. So we have to be really thoughtful. If lawmakers look at a number and go, well, clearly we don't need Savannas Act because the number of missing people have gone up. We have to hold their feet to the fire and say, no, that's expected. That's why Savannas Act was passed, so we could learn more and more about these cases. So we have to be gathering data, and we also have to be thoughtful about how we explain the data.
Yeah, I think that's a really key distinction there, because numbers don't really mean anything on their own. It's really important to have that story behind the numbers. And that's something we at Sovereign Bodies, we're always very transparent about. The numbers that we have are likely an undercount, because it's so difficult to get an accurate number of how many of our relatives are missing and murdered. So it's a long process, but I'm really thankful for legislation like this. And one thing that I think folks look at the Savannas Act and they're hoping that it's the answer to all of our prayers and it's going to end this issue. But my response is always that this issue has so many roots. It's rooted in colonialism, it's rooted in rape culture, it's rooted in victim blaming. There are just so many roots that we can only untangle each knot one at a time. And so I know this.
I on that note, I think one of the best books that explains that is Sarah's book, The Beginning and End of Rape. But you have to understand, right? Like, it's not like we woke up yesterday and we're like, whoa, Native women are getting murdered. This has been happening since 1492. And it's a cultural practice that Americans have accepted and have not yet fully condemned. And so I think her book does such an excellent job of kind of showing how the present is the past and the past is the present, because we haven't yet said that was wrong and it's wrong that we're still doing it today. And I think that's why we have a legal framework that at its core is based on principles that dehumanize Native women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's so deeply ingrained too. You know, recently we had a press outlet reach out to us to do an interview about our latest report that we did in conjunction with the Yurok Tribal Court. And a big part of one of the main sections of that entire paper was about victim blaming and how prevalent that is in this area. And so before we did the interview, I asked the press outlet to send me the questions ahead of time. And one of the questions was, what can Native women do to make sure that they're not missing or murdered? And I was just like, what? Like this, like, did you even read our report? And so we obviously responded and put it just enlightened the interviewer how inappropriate that question was. And it turned out to be a really great experience because the reporter apologized, and even when we were on air, acknowledged that they had too participated in this.
You know, I think that's such an important point though, because I think we've got jerks out there who are racist, right? Like just racist, just prejudice. But then we have a lot of people who, you know, they aren't like raging racist, but they've got all this embedded, almost like subconscious prejudice that they don't understand. They don't even know it's there because it's so deeply embedded in their psyche, but it surfaces all the time. And, you know, I'm just thinking of like, you know, when I had my play Sovereignty out at the Marin Theater Company out there, not too far from you there in California, in the Bay Area, and the San Francisco Chronicle sent their white lady reporter out to do a review of the play. And her review of the play was like, yeah, I just don't think it's believable that like the Cherokee woman protagonist would be in a relationship with a white man who would rape her because she's too smart. And it's like, oh, so Native women who are in a relationship where they're beaten or raped by their boyfriend or significant other are just not smart, right? Like, but that's this idea that, oh, it only happens to the women who aren't intelligent enough, didn't make right choices. It's victim blaming, but it's there at the foundational level. It's there in the halls of Congress. It's there in the background, the psyche of white journalists. It's there at the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office. One of the first things they told Grace Bulltail and her whole family was, well, you know, those Native kids, I mean, Kisara just drank too much. And then of course the autopsy comes back and the toxicology report, nope, she definitely did not, definitely not even close to the amount of alcohol it would take to kill an 18-year-old girl. Well, she was on drugs, you know, she probably overdosed on drugs. You know, these Native kids, nope, toxicology report shows not even possible, not a single drug in her system. But this is what our families are up against. This is what we're up against. Anytime it has so many real world impacts. And so it's like everything we're talking about. Yes, we have to change the laws, but we also have to change the culture. And we have a culture that blames Native women. If you're a Native woman and you're a victim of violence, it's you probably did something that got you to that point, right? And there are so many people in positions of leadership or white journalists who have that idea and they don't even know they have that idea, and that they don't even understand that that's their starting assumption anytime they approach one of these cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we talk about how long policy takes to change. Well, it takes even longer to change societal views. But I do really think that policy like this is that first step to kind of undoing a lot of that societal harm.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of journalists that have picked up this case. I get calls from, you know, national, regional, local, and even student papers that hear MMIW and want to do a story on it. And I get far more emails than I can ever possibly answer. And so I feel badly, but I always try to refer them to other folks because I'm a full-time professor. But at any rate, I think that one thing we can learn, at least in the last few weeks, my experience has been, is because this act is in memory of Savanna and it's named Savannas Act, I think that has garnered more response because there's a story there, there's a face there, there's a name there. And I think the same kind of thing can happen at the tribal level, but of course would have to be up to the family. If the tribe wanted to pass a law providing for more infrastructure to address women and two-spirit people who go missing, that it could be named in memory of someone. And again, that's a sensitive matter. I realize there's taboos around that, but if it's an option, it does get people more engaged because there's a human being, not just public law, blah, 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 you know? And that's what I think. I've gotten so many requests from journalists that have seen the Savannas Act and read Savanna's story and then want to do a story on it. And I think that's one lesson that I think we've learned from just the last few weeks, actually.
Absolutely. And on that note, we are so thankful to Savanna's family for allowing, us to put this name on this bill, because I know how hard that has to be to, just constantly have your worst trauma that has ever happened to you just so public and out like that. And so our hearts really go out to that family. And we know that because of what happened to Savanna and because they were willing to share that story, we're hoping that it's not going to happen again and that we're able to prevent these issues from happening from the beginning. So with that, we're towards the end of our webinar, but I just wanted to give an opportunity to you both for any closing comments, maybe resources that you'd like to direct folks to who are listening to this, excited and want to do more. Maybe Sarah, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, thank you again to SBI and your amazing staff and volunteers and everyone that works there. You're constantly putting out educational materials and webinars and Zooms and all of it. I don't think a day goes by on Facebook when I don't see SBI like doing something to put it out there in the universe and to make it available to anyone who has access to the internet and Facebook. But I'm excited to see where this goes. I think the other issue we need to be keeping our eye on around the election and seeing what happens afterwards is to go back and get our Violence Against Women Act reauthorized. It passed the House. We got stuck in the Senate over stalemates on tribal jurisdictional issues, but that doesn't mean we should give up. And once VAWA is picked up again and becomes something that we continue to try to move, because like Mary Kathryn said, COVID put everything on a different timeline. But we can add more to this. Is, in other words, just because Savannas Act is about missing and murdered Indigenous women, that doesn't mean we can't also continue to address it within the Violence Against Women Act as well. So I would suggest to advocates and families and survivors, if you know of policies that need to change that we could put into VAWA, we may yet have an opportunity to continue to improve VAWA to address some of these issues. So you can't, we're not limited to Savannas Act. We can always amend Savannas Act, but we also have a big vehicle through the Violence Against Women Act where we can continue to assess the nature of the work that you all are doing out there, and then how can the changes be folded into some additional federal legislation.
Thank you. Mary Kathryn?
So, yeah, I think my closing thoughts would be exactly what Sarah just said. And, that this is a time for us to celebrate that we did achieve this, for Savanna's family, that they have honored her memory and her legacy in this way, and that we as Native women advocates, as allies, as Two-Spirit, who, in our communities, we've come forward and we achieved this. And this is a huge, huge victory. And I think it's important to celebrate our victories. I know we always have so much more work to do, but I think it can feel overwhelming if we don't just stop and realize, like, hey, we made this happen. And even though there's so much more work to do, even President Trump can't let himself not be doing something for MMIW at this point, right? Like, that's because of our advocacy, and that's because of our voices, and that's because of Savanna's family and folks like Grace Bulltail and Olivia Lone Bear's brother, Matthew, and all of, everyone out there who's been advocating, sharing these stories, fighting back against the FBI for not doing their job, local county law enforcement. So it's a real achievement that we got this. And like Sarah said, we'll keep working. We will get VAWA reauthorization done. It will happen. But I also want to thank everyone, because I know a lot of us on here have worked really hard to get to this point. And I just think it's an honor to work with you all and to be here tonight. And thank you again for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said earlier, we're equally as happy to have both of your partnerships and support. So that wraps it up for today's webinar about Savannas Act. This is part of a series that we're doing in October in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So our final webinar of this series is going to be next Tuesday, beginning at 11 o'clock Pacific time. And we're going to have an all men's panel to talk about domestic violence against men and boys, and just talking about how we can interrupt that cycle. Because we know a lot of times those who abuse our women are victims of abuse themselves. So we'll be diving into that conversation with some really amazing Native men that are doing some really great work in their communities. But until then, we'll catch you later. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.
Right. Yes, we're no longer live. So
okay. I think Sarah already left. She's like, out.
Right. Yes. Well, my computer hung in there. I've got 3% left. So woo.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was an honor.
Yes. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.